I think one of the most beautiful parts of having the privilege of going and getting a 4-year college degree is to take this time out in late adolescence, new adulthood, and take a breath and really think about who you are and learn more about yourself and expand your mind and try a few things that dead end on you. Try on being interested in business one day and policy the next and painting the third. But then eventually find your way and find a way to commit to doing something hard and commit to finishing it.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Keri Waters. Keri is the Chief Innovation Officer at the University of Austin, America's newest private university. And she's also a longtime entrepreneur. She has built 4 companies, exited 2. And she is bringing her background in the Silicon Valley tech world and startup building to the world of higher education. In today's episode, we talk about Keri's journey as an entrepreneur. We talk about the way the University of Austin is combining the liberal arts and entrepreneurship in their education and why those two things are so important. We talk about what they're looking for in their incoming students. And we talk about how Keri is building the university's centers of innovation in everything from space travel to asteroid mining to quantum computing. Keri was an absolute delight to talk to, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Keri, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited to talk to you. I feel like you have such an interesting perspective on the future of education in general because of your background and your current role. You're a lifetime entrepreneur who's now building the newest university in the country.
Right.
And you're coming at this not as a lifetime academic, but as a business person, which gives you a very interesting perspective, both in higher education, but also education more broadly, which is mostly being changed by entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to talk about this. Can you share very quickly to kick us off? I had Pano on the show a few months ago, so a lot of people who are listening are already kind of familiar with University of Austin. But for anyone who isn't, can you share very quickly just what you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. So the University of Austin is America's newest university, newest Tier 1 university. We're building a new university from the ground up that's dedicated to the fearless pursuit of truth. So that means we're open to all discourse that's civil. We're open to free inquiry, and we're really trying to develop well-rounded leaders that have a broad and deep classical liberal arts education, and that immediately put that into practice so that they develop agency and build kind of a long-term. They work on a long-term project called the Polaris Project, which is kind of our version of a capstone project, where they learn to take on big problems and break them down and do things that are going to be beneficial to society.
You guys are, in a lot of ways, championing the history of higher education and what's been good about the tradition of higher education. But in some ways, you're also going back to the ground floor and rethinking everything. I imagine there's lots of first principles thinking that is occurring as you're designing a brand new curriculum. Could you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. That has been so much fun. As you pointed out, I'm a serial startup person, and this is my first job in higher ed. So I should say up front, in some ways I remain blissfully ignorant of how this is supposed to work in other institutions.
Probably very helpful.
Yes, yeah, I think it is sometimes. But we definitely are rethinking things from the ground up. Like, for example, the way that we're doing admissions. Our Dean of STEM has developed with the assistance of all the deans, he's developed this algorithm for how we're looking at the whole person of a student, which we're really proud of. And I've been able to witness how much thought and care the deans have put into, really, they put a lot of time into reading every application and reviewing it. And, we're thinking that from the ground up. But it's all the big things and it's all the small things too. I mean, we're also just a startup that's trying to figure out how to grow out our physical presence and how much space we need next year and who's doing what. Everybody's job description kind of shifts every quarter. And that's been great. There are a lot of times where we have conversations as a leadership team where, we're trying to decide. The mission is clear. The mission is clear to all of us, but the devil's in the details, right? So we are, for example, right now, building out all of our housing policies and everything related to student life so that the students have this great package. This first crop of 100 students is about to transition from the admissions process to being part of our campus life. And we're standing up all of that now. And we're trying to figure out things like, we've said we're developing them as whole people and we're respecting the fact that they're young adults. And so how does that translate to housing policies? Are we the kind of place that has curfews? We don't know. We have to talk about that.
What about on the academic side, as you're thinking about the product educationally that you want to deliver to your students, but also kind of the archetype of the student that you want to have graduating from your university? How are you going back to the drawing board and thinking about what a college education ought to be?
Yeah, that is such a great question. So that is really pertinent for us right now. One thing that's really clear to all of us, and it's great. One of the things that I so value about UATX is that we value intellectual pluralism. So we are not all on the same page about the big things all the time, but we have really robust discussions about them. One value that we all share is the idea of civic entrepreneurship. So the type of student that we're looking to graduate is above all a great citizen of this country. Is somebody who's a well-educated voter, is somebody who's going to be of service to their community and is of service to their family. So that's a real guiding principle for us. So I've been doing a lot of reading, because I'm not an academic and now I'm trying to hang with all of these people that are so well-versed in the classics. I've gone back and I've been rereading a lot of my old textbooks, and I've been reading a lot about Cicero lately and his idea of the ideal citizen. And it included the idea that this person would be well-rounded, that they'd be versed in a number of subjects. And they'd be able to contribute to their society at whatever the limits were of their personal capabilities.
What a fun job that necessitates you going back and reading the ancient classics.
Right. Yes.
What a great gig.
Yeah.
Let's drill into this idea of civic entrepreneurship a little bit more. This is it's an interesting term. It's an interesting idea. What does it look like in practice? What does it mean?
Yeah, I think it means, I've had several businesses of my own, and I've been fortunate to be involved in some other people's startups. And, there's a difference between building a business because you think it's going to make money and building a business because you think it's going to fill a real need and make society a better place. And at this point in my life, I feel really fortunate to be in a place where I get to focus exclusively on the latter. And those are the only types of projects I want to work on and the only types of founders I like to work with. So I think it's about thinking about how what you're doing is pro-social. And it doesn't have to be, it can be on a grand scale or it can be on a smaller scale, but it should be something that's generally improving the lives of people in your community.
Do you have particular examples? We'll get into your own work in this area later, but are there particular examples that most people know about that you think are good champions of or good role models of what civic entrepreneurship can look like?
Oh, that's a great question. So there's a startup that I'm really fond of now, a smaller one, but here in Austin, called Quake. It's an augmented reality helmet for firefighters that allows firefighters to see through smoke and get in and out of dangerous situations faster. And I've been able to, work with this startup, and I've now been to a number of firefighting training facilities, which is eye-opening. Intellectually that the work that firefighters do is important and that it's hard. But when you actually put on the 100+ pounds of gear that they wear and you go into these blacked out environments, you realize that, being able to provide a tool that lets them actually pick out the edges of exits is it really is something that saves lives. That to me is a great example of civic entrepreneurship. I think that in the early days, I remember, when I lived in Silicon Valley, when Google was really taking off, they did a great job early on of, I think, being very, very pro-social. I think it's fair to say that maybe they've lost their way a little bit in some areas, and which is always a risk when a company gets to be a certain size and a certain level of maturity. But in the early days, they were great proponents of building tools that benefited humanity, organizing the world's information, respecting people's privacy, but also being a great place to work. They were pioneers in the Valley of longer maternity leaves and paternity leave. And I think that their influence is still felt throughout the tech industry. And I think that's, really admirable. It's easy to get lost in the news of the day.
One could, on the surface level, make the argument that most companies that are financially successful are doing something that people want. They're providing some service or some product that people think makes their lives better if they're going to spend money on it. But I think there's a much finer line here that you're talking about of like truly doing good. How would you help students understand, maybe how will you help students understand the difference between something that like people are buying because they think they need it or they think it's making their lives better versus something that's like truly doing good in like a very philosophical and maybe even moral sense? I don't know what terminology you even use to talk about this. You can correct my question however you want, but I imagine it's like an interesting thing to educate students on too.
Yeah. I think so the way I'm thinking about it now, and I'll say this, and hopefully, actually, I really hope that a year or two from now, I go back and I listen to this and I cringe at some of it, right? Because that'll mean that, we're taking a big enough swing now and we've learned some lessons. So, one of the things that I think is important is that I remember being 18, and I actually, my 18-year-old son is going to be one of these first 100 students at UATX. And so I know some kids of that age pretty well. And they're smart and they're passionate and they have big goals, but they haven't yet necessarily been exposed to all of the to the scope of what's available in the world, what problems need solving, the best ways to go about it. So while thinking about the Polaris Project and it being a very individual project and something that's driven by our students, I also want to give them examples. We're building out initiatives of in areas that we think are really important for society in general and for our country to maintain its leadership in the world. And as we're building out those initiatives and we're hiring faculty to work on these problems, we really want to inspire our students to think about, raising the ambition of these projects and raising their own ambitions in life. So this includes, for example, we're working on an applied quantum computing initiative. We're working on a geoengineering initiative. We're working on something that's several things in space tech. So I think, space tech is one of the most important sectors of technology in the coming decades. So we looked at that from the top down and said, okay, if it's important, if space tech is important, what are the most important subcategories? And we think that asteroid mining is going to be incredibly important strategically in the coming decades. But not just asteroid mining, it's the idea, if you unpack that a little further, there are schools of thought about whether even if you agree that asteroid mining is important, are we going to do it with just with robots, or do we really need human space travel to enable that? And we're of the opinion, we're on the side of the people who say, look, to solve a problem this big and this complex and this far out into space, we're probably going to need humans, close to where the action is to help solve problems, at least at first. So that train of thought led us to finding a really talented new member of our faculty, Dr. Elia Overby, who is joining us as our first professor of bioastronautics, which is a cool word that I just learned not too long ago. This is a brand new field, which is the idea. She basically is a genomics researcher who studies the effects of long-term space travel on the human body. So we are building out a bioastronautics lab, and we intend to be the preeminent lab in the country for astronaut omics samples, which is so incredibly cool. So we're picking sectors like this one after another. They're not all in STEM. A lot of them are in STEM because, this is my bias showing. I think technology touches so many areas of our lives. But again, with trying to grow well-rounded citizens, we're also very passionate about public policy and about the arts. If we're going to continue to lead, we also need to continue to lead in the area of aesthetics and beauty, and great art should continue to drive society forward as well, right? So we have initiatives thinking about what the future of art might look like, future of economics and governance, things like post-growth economies, cryptocurrencies, and DAOs. And in all these initiatives, we're kind of building them out in conjunction with the academic centers. And we're also engaging really directly with private industry, with corporate, with companies that are actively working in this space that can help keep us honest about the curriculum we're developing and make sure that it's really relevant to solving these problems today. So by looking at the problems kind of top down, where can we make the biggest impact on society? I'm hoping that that's going to provide kind of a framework for our students to start thinking about where their projects might fit in, and that's ultimately what's going to drive the ability to create these well-rounded citizens.
You're a STEM person, so you're an interesting person to ask this question of. One of the big trends in the conversation around the future of education is making education more practical, which leads to a very heavy emphasis on STEM-related things, as well as just like practical skills that a student will use in their day-to-day lives. What's the case for art also being important? I agree with you, but I want to hear how you're thinking about this in relation to all of these very interesting STEM initiatives that you're also building out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's easier than ever to make that case. I mean, look, I did an engineering degree in the 90s at MIT, and when I graduated from high school, it was kind of obvious that, one of the right things to do, with air quotes, was to go get an engineering degree and go work in engineering. And the first jobs that I had out of engineering school were very much about making technology work, in a kind of a nascent growth period of the early internet, right? You may be familiar with a concept called Moore's Law, which kind of drove was a very strict law in the technology industry for decades. It was this idea that about every 18 months, computing power would double. And that led to, you could reliably forecast, a rate of change in the availability of technology and what you could build on the technology that would be available, 3 years out or 5 years out. I started my career in the semiconductor industry, and this drove a lot of our decision making. Now we're in a phase where Moore's Law has come to an end for transistors as they exist today. The current generation, the current architecture that we have for semiconductors relies on transistors, and transistors have become so small that the pathways for information to travel within them is only a little bit bigger than an electron. Like, we're not going to be able to make transistors any smaller. That said, lo and behold, here we have this new compute architecture that's emerging, which is quantum computing. And in the case of quantum computing, which is rapidly reaching the point where it's more powerful than classical computing for a lot of applications, Moore's Law happens every month. Every time you add another qubit, you double the compute power of a quantum computer, and that happens every month. So when you think about that, I was talking recently with the CEO of a quantum computing company who told me, right now we have processors that are able to solve, problems that it's sort of like we're about as good as 2 or 3 GPUs. But with the next generation architecture that's coming out next year, one machine is going to be about as powerful as like 3.7 million GPUs, right? So when you think about that and you bringing it back to your original question of, why is art important? Well, why are the liberal arts important? It's because it's no longer good enough to just learn technical skills. What you really need to do is learn how to think. I think it's more important than it's ever has been to get a very traditional classical liberal arts education, to be broadly and deeply educated and to be able to call on, the great works and have a framework and have a really a longer understanding of the arc of history and solutions that have been tried before. And that extends to art and aesthetics and to the way people felt about change at different points. And once you have that basis, then there are plenty of tools out there that will help you, kind of make progress on any good idea that you might have. That's less important. What's more important is the critical thinking.
One of the things that really surprised me when I first got into the startup world is how well-read every founder I ever met was. And they weren't just well-read in the arena of business books and, current events. They could sit and debate deep philosophical ideas for hours. And they could quote great thinkers throughout history. And I was so surprised because I didn't realize that there would be a correlation. I was very young. I got my first startup job when I was 19. So I didn't have a lot of context for the working world in general. But I remember being very struck by that and also very excited because I liked to read things. So I was like, oh, good, I'm going to fit in here.
Yeah.
But I think that correlation is kind of underappreciated at times when people are thinking practically about what their education should look like, what their kids' education should look like. It's so certification focused and so credentialing focused. And, at the end of the day, that means the piece of paper matters and the test scores matter, not the quality of thinking.
Right.
And yet, for the people who are actually out and building things, that depth of thinking is so important. And this has been it seems consistent across the board. This is a pretty unequivocal trend. How do you think about the importance of the liberal arts within different types of trajectories for your students? I know that you guys are, you want to accept the best of the best, the very ambitious kids, the ones who are excited to go deep on big ideas, even if there's not a clear-cut application for them. They're just excited about it. But how do you think about, if a kid wants to be a public intellectual, obviously going deep on big ideas matters. If they want to start a company, being able to think philosophically about what they're building is pretty important. But there aren't always super obvious applications for the liberal arts for different career paths. How do you think about that? Or what's the sales pitch even within the University of Austin to your students about why this is something that they should be really excited to go get an education in?
Yeah. Oh, I think that's great. So I'm going to steal a line from our provost here. Our provost, Jake Howland, was saying the other day, we were debating this exact point. And, he was saying, it's actually, we keep trying to kind of crystallize the way we talk about the intersection between the liberal arts and entrepreneurship. And I think he stumbled on something great when he said, yeah, if you want to call yourself a novelist, you actually need to go out and publish a book. You can't, there are plenty of us who have, I'm one of these people who have lots of little hobby writing projects that are at various stages of development. But I'm not a novelist. If you want to be a painter, you should go out, you should be prepared to go out and sell your art and make your art available to the world for comment, because that's part of it. I think that's the way I'm thinking about it for the liberal arts, which is not to say, I think one of the most beautiful parts of having the privilege of going and getting a 4-year college degree is to take this time out in late adolescence, new adulthood, and take a breath and really think about who you are and learn more about yourself and expand your mind and try a few things that dead end on you. Try on being being interested in business one day and policy the next and painting the third, but then eventually find your way and find a way to commit to doing something hard and commit to finishing it and not just kind of dabbling.
This is a great segue into the next thing I want to ask you about, because I want to talk about the Polaris Project. I think this is one of the coolest things about the curriculum that you're designing, at least that I've seen thus far. Can you talk a little bit about what this is?
Yeah, so this is it's a little bit like a capstone project, but the idea is it's a sequence, it's curriculum, but also an independent project that you might take on fully independently or with a group of students to achieve an ambitious goal by the time you graduate. So we actually know what some of them will be because our students, they're so creative, and a number of them are so ambitious. Like, we have some students who have already made full feature-length films. We have students who've started businesses and have started running them. But these are the ideas of the types of Polaris projects that they'll undertake. And so it'll start with all of our students in the fall of their freshman year will take a class called Polaris Ideas, which is a class in creativity where they'll get to do exercises. They'll read inspiring stories about people's lives and the kind of big undertakings that they took on. They'll learn about creativity. They'll do exercises like writing down their mental chatter for a few days and reading it back to themselves and seeing what that reveals. And they'll do things like DISC assessments and Myers-Briggs, and in a group setting, really challenge their own preconceived notions of who they are, what they're good at, what they're interested in. And that is fully integrated. So from that point onward, there's something like 21 credit hours out of their 180 for graduation will be courses in creativity, in building the skills needed to evaluate an idea, like case study analysis. Depending on, as they get later in their educational career, it'll start to bifurcate to be closer to the centers, the academic centers. So, for example, if you're starting a business, more of the classes will be focused around skills development for that, market modeling, competitive positioning. And in a lot of the skills translate, like building an audience. You need to build an audience for what you're doing for just about any undertaking in this day and age, right?
Yes, you do.
Yes, and that I'd love to hear your perspective on that. But connecting our students with mentors. Like, for example, if we have students who want to get into podcasting, I'd hope to call on somebody like you to, give them some advice. So that's kind of the frame, and I think what's really special about it, and I'm coming to realize is really novel, is the amount of individual attention and the amount of support each student gets to bring their idea to life, and also the bar that we're setting for graduation. So, for example, if you want to do a startup, in my book, in order to graduate, you should get to the point where you develop an idea and you've either reached first revenue, first patent, or first outside investment in order to graduate. And that's what makes you an entrepreneur.
I love that. I love the real world test to pass. I think that's so valuable to have that be baked directly into the experience from the onset. What does the progression look like over the course of the 4 years? Because in the first 2 years, they're doing an intensive study of the classics and like the Western canon. And then in their third and fourth year, they're starting to specialize a little bit more. How much of their time in that second set of years is focused on the Polaris Project? And also in the first couple of years, like how much time are they spending on it? By the end of those 2 years, like how far along in their idea are they supposed to be? Are they supposed to be already building something? Are they supposed to have a roadmap? What does this progression look like? Or is it still in development?
Yeah. So both. I can tell you what it looks like, and I'll also tell you, I reserve the right. Like all of these are plans, and like any early stage startup plan, we'll see what survives. It's first interaction with the market, right? So we talk about these first 100 students being the brave 100, and we also talk about them being founders. And I really do think of them as founders because we're going to co-develop a lot of this together. But the progression right now, so in the first 2 years, they are going to be taking a lot of intellectual foundations, a lot of core curriculum, but they are going to take a few classes in Polaris. The first one being that class in creativity. In the sophomore year, they're going to the idea of the first year is to expand your mind, right? And then year 2 is about learning to identify a good idea. So there are a couple of classes that they'll take. One is called Polaris Inspirations, which is a speaker series and a case study series. And they'll learn how to do case study analysis and how to evaluate the ideas from the case studies through this lens of civic entrepreneurship. Then in the end of sophomore year, by the end of sophomore year, they'll be taking a class called Polaris Frame, which is when they'll start pitching their ideas. And this, in what we're hoping to do, and I'm still trying to work out the logistics of this with, we are a full-fledged university with a full schedule and a lot of, scheduling constraints. The registrar is, doing a very hard job right now, but we are hoping to make that more of an all-class that's essentially run like, I don't know if you've ever done an unconference where you're kind of, all the participants kind of come together every week and you pick out topics that you need to cover to make progress on your project. And you kind of, others who want to join that conversation can join. And so I'm imagining we're putting a big emphasis on interdisciplinary projects. We think, the most interesting problems to solve tend to be interdisciplinary. And we really hold that as a high value, again, in being well-rounded. So I don't see a different way right now logistically to do it than to say, oh, okay, so you're interested in quantum computing, but you're not sure if you want to study more of the STEM aspects. You want to work on the technology and do some of the testing of the hardware, or you're interested in policy and how this is going to relate to geopolitics. Okay, well, we have a session over here where we're going to look at, this is what the work might look like, and this is how you might break down the project in STEM, and this is more, here's some of the basics in policy, and here's what that project might look like. So we're kind of that's the idea, is that by the end of their sophomore year, they've developed one or two ideas, and by the beginning of their junior year, they take a class called Polaris Pitch, where they solidify their project and then they pitch it to other students. I should actually pause here and back up a little bit and point out that, this is the progression of the actual formal academic curriculum, but the whole idea, one of the interesting things that I think the founders of UATX did, including Pano, our president, is the Polaris Center that I'm leading is responsible for this Polaris project, but also all of student life. And that's intentional, right? In our mind, this 4-year time that you're spending at college, you shouldn't have all these aspects of your day that are so disconnected from each other. So if you're trying to, if the point of the Polaris Project is to help launch a new adult and to help you, learn who you are in the world, then even your leisure activities should kind of be related to that. So as students are going through this sequence of courses, the staff, the faculty, the advisory staff are coming together, and we're constantly kind of talking about what's going on with each student and what do they need. Oh, this student, came in to do STEM, but is suddenly finding an interest in policy. We're working on internships for next summer. Maybe we should be looking for congressional internships here. This student, this student is doing great academically, is struggling to work in a group. Maybe we should recommend that they join the rowing club because they could work on learning some teamwork. That's kind of how we're thinking about this kind of integrated approach.
Today's episode is brought to you by the John Galt Mortgage Company. I promised myself when I started the show that I was never going to have a sponsor unless I could truly endorse what they are doing. And that could not be more true for the John Galt Mortgage Company. My friends Mitch and Tim started the company earlier this year after working in the real estate world for years and realizing that mortgages are way more expensive than they need to be. Most real estate agents don't actually know how much extra profit is baked into the cost of a mortgage. So Mitch and Tim started a new kind of mortgage, one where they cap their own profits on every transaction and pass the savings along to you, the buyer, in the form of a lower interest rate. If you are in the market for a house, I absolutely recommend checking out what Mitch and Tim are doing. You can find more at www.johngaltmortgage.com, or you can find the link below in the show notes. Okay, back to the show. A lot of moms listening to this show, and probably dads too, would probably be curious to hear you speak to this. What are you looking for in applicants?
We are looking for, so our president says we're looking for grace, grit, and gratitude, which I think is a great way of looking at it. We actually have this whole framework that the deans have developed where we're looking for evidence of leadership, creativity, and academic aptitude. We do factor in standardized test scores because we want to have some kind of objective measures. But we are looking for that whole package, and there's a heavy emphasis on the essays and the way the student talks about demonstrates that they have some ambition in life and some steps that they've taken to do hard things.
And I know that you're friendly towards students who are coming from non-traditional education backgrounds. I know you have multiple of them in your founding 100. How do you think about kids coming out of non-traditional schools, homeschooling, private schools, weird experimental private schools? Is that like actively factored into the way you review applications, or is it so case by case that it really kind of varies?
I would say, it's really case by case. We do have, I don't, if you think about it, I don't think it surprises me that we have right now, we do seem to have a disproportionate number of students who come from these non-traditional schooling backgrounds. And I think that's because their families are already kind of, predisposed. They're not adverse to risk, and they're not adverse to new models of education, which of course were brand new. So I think that explains a lot of that. And our students are really up for the challenge of joining us, being on board with what we're trying to do, and knowing that, all the details of year 4 aren't totally nailed down yet.
Part of the fun.
Exactly. You sort of have to have that feeling. And you can tell, it's really funny how day to day, we have such an interesting culture internally at UATX. I mean, I love it. These are some of the greatest people I've ever worked with. And of course, in order to undertake an effort like this, you need a real diversity of backgrounds. So we have people who, have a lot of higher education experience, and we have some people who have a lot of startup experience. And those are two cultures. They come together. You can tell when things get a little chaotic. There are some people who are energized and some people who are anxious. And it's really obvious. Yes.
How does the melding of academia and startups work? Because I really want to get into the nitty-gritty of this, because you're building a startup. It's brand new, but at the same time, you're building a university. It's still an academic institution. And you have, like you just said, you have people from both sets of backgrounds coming in. And those are very different paradigms about how to approach work and how to approach building something.
Right.
What is I know this was a very deliberate decision to have a very strong startup culture inside of the university, not just because it's new, but because of what it's intended to be. Mm-hmm. But how does this meld actually work in the day-to-day? And maybe what are some of the edges that you think you have over a traditional and established university because you have such a strong startup culture?
Oh, that is a great question. So I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm one of these people with a startup background, right? So I'm always thinking about, what are the advantages we have to being small? What are our unfair advantages that we can exploit here? And a big part of it is actually our ability to move fast. I mean, people say that, and it sounds like an easy thing to say, but in practice, I'm learning things every day about how higher ed works, and not because, there are a lot of great universities out there, but they're big institutions, and they're very social. They make decisions by consensus and with large groups of people. So they can't move as fast as the world is moving to, for example, overhaul their curriculum. We keep hearing we meet with lots and lots of big companies, and I won't name names here, but our dean of STEM and I have talked to so many, especially engineering-focused companies, and their engineering leadership says, we just don't feel like we can retire because we don't have a bench of talent. Like the world has changed so quickly, and the skills that are required have changed so fast that, I've been trying to work with my alma mater for 5 years to make a couple of changes in how mechanical engineering is taught, for example, and it just they can't move that quickly. So that's the main advantage I would say that we have today. And also just our connection to the real world, the fact that we are, so close to industry and we can connect our students so quickly to industry. How that plays out day to day, we do have one of the other things that's really helpful is we're governed by a constitution, which I think is fascinating, and the more and more I learn about it and the more I live with it, the more fascinating it becomes to me because it helps provide a nice frame for how we do some of the core things that a university does. Like, for example, admitting students. We have some clear guidelines about who gets to make those decisions. In our case, it's the deans. They get together and they have the absolute right, they can't be overruled by, the fundraising team or some other team to admit a student that they don't think should be admitted. So the Constitution helps, and that kind of guides some of the core day-to-day university functions. On the operating the business of the university, that's where the startup skills really come forward because it's important, and we've done a lot of work internally to bring everybody along to using kind of modern tool chains like you would use in a startup, like using we use Google Workspace and Slack and Monday.com for our project management, and that's important to keep a really small, lean staff all on the same page when you don't have that massive apparatus that universities have.
The thought of a university operating by not using those things is frightening to me.
I know. Blissful ignorance here. Yes.
Same here. I talk to a lot of people who are building new education programs, mostly in the K-12 space. You guys are kind of unusual in that you're a brand new program in the higher ed world thinking about these same questions, which is part of why I'm so excited about what you're doing. But I talk to a lot of founders who are building everything from like networks of schools, project-based schools, online schools, programs that can function within a school, homeschooling resources. And again, I'm just so amazed by the contrast between someone who has an entrepreneurial background and is thinking about education from the perspective of a business. Like, the primary goal is not to make money. Money is necessary for sustaining the business, but the primary goal is to educate a child, or ideally many, many children. But you're still thinking about it through the lens of business and moving very quickly because you have to adapt in order to, you're testing your product, and if it's not working, you have to fix it very quickly or you're going to go out of business.
Right.
But there aren't very many things holding you back. And so, there aren't school boards and departments of education that you have to move through in order to make some fundamental shift. You can just do it. You're only held back by how quickly you can build something. And it's very interesting to me to watch how rapidly these types of programs often change and also how efficiently they change. And it's very inspiring to see that, but it's also very not inspiring to see how slowly everything else moves and how many roadblocks are in place. You guys are doing something very interesting with that same spirit in higher education. Do you feel a sense that you're going to continue to iterate very quickly and will be able to just like really outpace, not just now in the early developmental dreaming up what your curriculum should be stage, but like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you'll be able to continuously just outpace everybody else around you because you're not beholden to these big calcified organizational systems? Or do you feel like as the university scales, that speed might slow?
Yeah. So I think it depends. I think we can. So one thing I will point out is we aren't completely footloose and fancy free, and I think that's good. It's good to have some constraints that you're building within, right? So one of the constraints that our founders decided on early was that we do want to become accredited. We want to be a tier one university. We want to be considered alongside the Ivy League, and that means we want our students. If we're graduating the best leaders, we want them to be able to go on to medical school or law school or whatever. So the accreditation process does create certain constraints that we're operating within. That said, it's about creativity and learning how to operate within those constraints and continue to move quickly. I think the real answer to your question is we can continue to iterate rapidly if we maintain that spirit in the people that we're hiring. But also, I'm a big believer that it's all about incentives. So we need to create a system. First of all, we need to maintain our independence, which Western capital society means revenue. We need to make money, and we need to diversify our streams of revenue so that we're not totally beholden on tuition, so that we can be a healthy institution, offer an outstanding education at a reasonable price, but have all the resources we need to do what we want. So I think that, and that's exciting to me because that leads us down the path of thinking about, doing more with industry and doing more creative things that way. We also need to get the incentives right with our faculty and staff so that we don't develop those calcified processes. I don't think that the people who work at other universities aren't smart. I don't think that they're, I think that they think about these things. And I think there are a lot of great, smart people who see the problems that they have, but they're just within they're within a system that's become so large and unwieldy that they can't operate within it. So we have to not repeat those same mistakes. So, for example, we've already said we're not offering tenure because we don't think tenure works in the way that it's supposed to. So what does that mean as an alternative? We would say that, the university of now, the university of the future, isn't supposed to be kind of an ivory tower where you're in a monastery, separate from the world. Instead, it should be a platform where you come to do your very best work. We should be able to attract the best and brightest faculty, and they should be able to do their best research, and they should be able to create IP, and then they should be able to enjoy the benefits of that with our support. And we should build a diaspora of startups around us that spin out from our faculty and our graduates, and share in some of the revenue of that, but they should be able to keep more of that. And that's how we'll build an ecosystem that remains vibrant, that remains current, and that can iterate really rapidly.
I've heard you all talk about this vision for having companies spinning out of the university. I know you also want to become a launching pad for public intellectuals, people who are building audiences and helping to shape the discourse around both current events and the future. Are there other big archetypes in your mind of types of students that you're really hoping to support and cultivate?
Yeah. You mean
sort of career paths, or not career paths isn't maybe quite the right question, the right wording, but
what do I envision our graduates to
are there
doing?
other big sort of that's a very clear cut path, seeing graduates going on to build companies or become commentators? Are there other I know innovations a really big that often falls under the realm of building companies, but are there other very specific or broad avenues that come quickly to mind when you think about trajectories your graduates might embark on?
Yeah, I think the other big one is policy. We're wanting to see, that's a passion. We happen to have our dean of economics, politics, and history is a constitutional law expert. We are, of course, governed by a constitution, and he's a big believer that more institutions should be governed by a constitution. We expect to have a lot of students that are really passionate about policy and making policy change, and so I'd expect to see more of them going into public service in that way. we are also just in the process. Our newest center is a Center for Education and Public Service, which we haven't even hired our dean yet. We're just kind of standing up and incubating our ideas about how we are going to have a broader impact in affecting the way that education is delivered broadly in this country, including K through 12, which I think is really exciting.
That's very exciting. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that one.
Yes, I'll bet. Yeah.
I want to talk about your background too, because you have such a wide array of experiences that you're bringing to the table that I imagine are also really coloring how you're thinking about this. You mentioned earlier you were originally an engineer, and then you went on to start 4 companies and exit 2.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about this journey from, like, this is an interesting career arc going from working in, you said, the semiconductor industry all the way through to now helping build a new university. Can you tell this story?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to tell you the short version. I knew I wanted to be an engineer. I can't remember when I was younger thinking, oh, I really want to be a CEO. That wasn't really at the forefront of my thinking. I was always ambitious and kind of headstrong. I liked to write, and I liked engineering, and I moved to Silicon Valley after I graduated from college, in large part because I couldn't deal with this winters in Boston anymore.
That's reasonable.
Yes, yeah.
So you moved to Texas with a few stops along the way.
Yeah, exactly. Got here as fast as I could, as they say. Although the summers are trying me now, I'm kind of like, okay, I'm sorry I complained about snow so much.
They're a little brutal.
Yes, exactly. Maybe I could find some moderation. But I thought, I've joked, but it's also true. I moved to California, and I grew up, I was a Marine Corps brat. My dad was a fighter pilot in the Marine Corps, and so we moved a lot when I was a kid. And so when I moved to California, I was kind of thinking of it like I was going to do a stint. I'd live there for a couple of years, and I'd go home. And then I met my husband, and he's a native Californian, and he likes to surf. And so then I was there 22 years. And,
funny how that happened.
Yes, exactly. And it was great, of course. But we lived in Santa Cruz, California, which is on the beach, a little bit on the outskirts of Silicon Valley. Lovely place, great place for surfing. But a smaller economic footprint and not so many tech jobs. And that was fine when I was young, pre-kids. My husband and I both commuted into the Valley. I always had like an hour commute to go anywhere. And then, I kind of, at the time I was working, I worked in product design. And I started in the late 90s when hardware was really on a decline. The internet was booming. Software was eating everything. All of the hardware jobs were moving to the Midwest or Guadalajara and Silicon Valley. Like, hardware was out. And so I thought, oh, God, I've made this terrible mistake. If I was a mechanical engineer, I decided to become a software developer. So I went back to Stanford Extension to take some kind of upper division software development classes. And this is a true story. My instructor for Intro to C programming was, at the time, a grad student named Marissa Meyer. And she said, I'll never forget, on the first day of class, she said, I'm working for this startup called Google. It's kind of like Alta Vista, if you know what that is. I don't know if you know Marissa Meyer, but she later went on to become VP of product at Google, and then she was the CEO of Yahoo. But this was when she was still a grad student at Stanford. And I remember I took my exam, and on my first exam, she wrote, at the time, Google was fewer than 50 people, I think. And she wrote on my exam, we're looking for women programmers. You should apply. And I remember I called my dad, and I said, Dad, I have this job offer. It's like an entry-level web developer job at Cisco, like doing web pages for the sales portal. Or I've got this interesting thing. I could maybe go to this little startup. And he was like, take the sure bet, Keri, take the security, So that was one of my funny near misses early on. But so I didn't do that. And I've thought about that later, right? I'm now much braver about taking risks. But yeah, in those early days, like late 90s, I mean, it was crazy. Everything was booming. It was hard to tell. I was just trying to get my legs under me. And, Anyway, I ended up at this tiny startup that was a consumer electronics startup. It was making a set-top box that it was called Molino Networks, and it was a wonderful education, flash in the pan. We made Time's best products of the year and had this great launch, and we were going to be a big thing for a hot minute. And we were trying to raise a Series A, and I had joined this small team to write the web interface to the set-top box, so that you could sit with your laptop on the couch and like manage your digital photos and your DVDs, that you would watch on your TV from a laptop. But to raise our Series A, the investor said, we really want to see that you can build hardware. We think you should be a software licensing company, but if you really want to be a product company, we want to see that you can build hardware. And we were almost out of money. And so our CEO said, "You're a mechanical engineer, right? Like, we're going to buy one CAD license, and can you just design us like a beta unit?" So I designed a very simple front bezel. We used an off-the-shelf Linux motherboard, built basically a Linux PC with a very basic front bezel, and we hand assembled 35 units on the floor of this office. And that was our beta run. And I was hooked on startups from there. And that company ran out of money. I ended up moving into semiconductor, and I ended up moving to our semiconductor partner. And I got a job as I was the director of strategic marketing for kind of two mid-sized semiconductor companies. We made H.264 decoders, which are high definition video audio decoders. And my job, strategic marketing, was to build out the software that went on top of these systems for connected TVs and Blu-ray players. So my team would build out the software all the way up. I licensed Netflix onto I worked with Dolby and DTS, and then we would build out like the electronic programming guide, and we would sell to customers like Sony and Samsung and LG. And it was such a great education in marketing. I really think I'm not sure that there's a better place in industry than the semiconductors. Maybe like consumer packaged goods at Procter & Gamble would be as good. But in the tech industry, getting to work in strategic marketing in the semiconductor world was brilliant because it's a constrained market. You learn rules like the country rivalries. If you get Samsung, you're not going to get LG. And if you get Sony, you're not going to get Panasonic, and vice versa, right? But you learn the rules. Like each OEM has a primary supplier and a secondary supplier. And so you could map out, and there's a relatively small number of competitors. You could map out a couple of years in advance a few scenarios of what your sales were going to be. And then you knew once you got the tier ones, those were the tier one OEMs, then you'd go fight over, the tier threes in Taiwan that were building kind of the off-brand devices that you could go buy at Walmart or whatever. And it was a great place to learn strategic marketing and market modeling in general. And I loved that job. I worked there. I worked in that field for a while. And then when I was having my second son, I just couldn't do that work anymore. Like I worked for a company that was headquartered in Germany. So my bosses were in Germany. I was in California. My team was in Shanghai and in Serbia. The customers were all over Asia. So I was on calls at like 4 and 5 in the morning and at 8 p.m. And so I got to the point where I just, that wasn't working with the kids. And my husband and I talked about moving. And, we didn't want to move for a variety of reasons. So the funny enough, that's why I started my first company, because I wanted to be closer to my kids and have more control over my time. And that's why I did my first startup.
Was that a difficult transition to go from, working at these fast-growing companies in Silicon Valley to starting your own? Or was it like a very easy, clear-cut, it's like, okay, I'm a mom now. I want to be close to my kids. I'm just going to do this. Was it challenging or was it just exciting?
It was really challenging. Oh my gosh. Yeah, it was at the beginning. I don't know if exciting would be the right word. I mean, my early memories are all fun, but they were like, I remember we rented So the initial business plan, my first company was called Chopwood. Like, I don't know if you know the Zen cone. Before Enlightenment, Chopwood, Keri Water.
Mm-hmm.
After Enlightenment, Chopwood, Keri Waters was
Yes.
the idea. So it was called Chopwood, and I had this group of friends that also wanted to be able to live and work in Santa Cruz, didn't want to commute over the hill anymore. And so our whole business plan was figure out how to work in Santa Cruz, which I always say, like, as business plans go, I've heard worse, but it wasn't like it wasn't great, like it was a start. And we had, I had this core team of software developers that were great at cloud engineering, and we were trying to bootstrap with services. And I remember we tried a couple things. We had a couple of nascent product ideas, but I didn't really know how to bring a product idea to life. And we were bootstrapping, so we were doing client work, and that became all consuming. And it just became kind of, it was a little, like, I remember these long days in this little office that we had rented, this like really cheap office that had full direct Western exposure. So we would get all this sunlight, and it was a gray stucco building with a metal roof. We called it the Jiffy Pop container because it would get so hot inside. And I remember one afternoon, we went to Costco because it was across the street and air conditioned, and so we were just like walking around for a while, like eating free samples. We had no money in the bank account, and my co-founder Joel and my husband Ian, who I was working with at the time, they went and found a portable air conditioner, and they were like, I was the only person who had a corporate credit card, and they were like, you're buying this for the office. And I was like, that is $700 we do not have. I'm not buying it. And they literally chased me through Costco with it until I bought it. But those are the kind of early memories that I remember. It's just, very low bank account balance, figuring out the origami of, okay, making payroll and the next contract. But you know what? Of course, those were valuable experiences. And really, that's the core entrepreneurship experience, right? Is like, what are you going to do? Nobody's here to tell you what to do. You have to figure out how to make money and make payroll.
How does that balance with being a mother? Those are two full-time jobs.
Yes. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, not of course not perfectly all the time, but what's great is I've always felt like my work and my life are really integrated. My coworkers are my friends and my family, and my kids have always been involved in what I've been doing, and they've enjoyed it. My older son always really liked to get into designing the swag for whatever he always had great swag ideas and was really into that. And my younger son has always been a tinkerer, and he'd be in the lab. And especially my third startup was a hardware startup, which is my big labor of love, my biggest passion. And he loved being in the lab and getting scrap parts and building little robots out of them. So that's, it. To be honest, I've had more trouble balancing when I've worked in the corporate world, and I've had less control over how I spend my time. But when my kids were young, there were a lot of late nights, like after they'd gone to bed, and doing really weird things with my schedule so that I could have enough time with them and also make progress.
This is one of my favorite parts about your story, because I don't have children yet, but I'm very entrepreneurial and I'm intending to be a mother. And so this is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, even as I'm thinking about like what projects I'm invested in longer term, like how does this square with also like being present with kids? And so I love hearing people talk about how they've made that work and the way the pieces have fit together, because one, is just very useful intel for me, but two, it's very inspiring. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how your kids got involved in your businesses, or like even just were around as you were building businesses, because I imagine that was an incredible education for them. The world must feel so much more malleable if you're growing up watching your parents figure out how to make something from nothing, and you just have this conception that that's possible from a very early age. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looked like?
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, they would come in. so we had help. One of the things that really helped is my husband. My husband has always been, of course, really supportive, but also he's a software developer. So he was very early on the remote work and hybrid work train. So he, even in the earliest days when our kids were young, we did, we had help who came in. We had a nanny who would come in and help us. But one of us was always home, and that really helped. And then, and then of course our office was just family friendly. So the kids would come after school and they'd play there, and they'd play with the kids of my coworkers and friends. And I remember being really proud when my son Wyatt was really young. I overheard him telling another kid's mom that I was an inventor, that's how he thought of it. Like, my mom invents things. And I thought, how cool is that? Because his framework, his frame of reference for inventors is like from, Phineas and Ferb and Perry the Platypus. And I thought, that's cool. My son thinks I'm Perry the Platypus. Yeah, that's kind of how I always said to my kids, I've never been a great bake sale mom. I'm not a great cook. Fortunately, my husband is, or as he jokes, we would live on baked potatoes and Diet Coke. But fortunately, he's a great cook. And so I'm not going to be the greatest bake school mom. It might be store-bought brownies, but I introduce my kids to the coolest people. I introduce them to astronauts and founders and artists, and that feels really good. I think that's really valuable for them.
I remember reading years ago about the Alcott kids, Louisa May Alcott and her sisters, and how their dad knew so many of the literary lights of their time. And many of them lived in New England, very in close proximity to each other. And so when they were growing up, their dining table would often be graced by all of these literary icons who were just friends with their dad. Yes. And I remember reading that and thinking, that is such a cool way to think about raising children. Mm-hmm. Like, not everybody is going to know the best-selling authors of their time, or even want to necessarily. Like, those aren't necessarily the right role models to be putting in front of your kids. But thinking about like meeting cool people, with one of the benefits being your kids get to meet them too. Like, if you're doing interesting work and you're surrounded by interesting people and your kids get to see that and it's real and it's not just something they see on TV or read about online and feel like it's this like distant aspirational thing. I think that's so powerful. And I love that was part of what you were able to give your kids by building businesses. I just think that's so cool.
Yeah. I mean, that's all the people that are in our house all the time are people who are building something, who are working on something. And I do think it's been good for them. They've seen, I think it's really good that they have seen some success at that, because they've certainly seen the struggle, right? They've seen the many late nights, and they've seen, and not just the projects that I've done or been involved in, but yeah, the friends, the people that come over, and they overhear the phone conversations. There's a whole a support group of founders that talk to each other and support each other in ways that I don't think, it's hard to find other people who fully understand what it takes to build something from scratch. And so they've heard and seen a lot of examples of that. So it's been really sweet when they've seen the successes that come from that. I remember, they were so excited. It was so cool. My friend Ryan had an electric skateboard company called Inboard, and he was on Shark Tank, and that was, such a big deal. And they were so proud of that and got to tell their friends about that. And then Ryan came over and, took him out and taught him to ride a skateboard. I mean, to be able to kind of connect the dots in that way, and see how you can have an idea, work on it, struggle, build on it. I think that's really important for all kids.
I have one more very big category of question that I want to ask you. Everybody in education is talking about AI. Some people are talking about it from a very positive place. Some people are very frightened by it. No matter where you stand, it's pretty obvious that it's going to dramatically change the career landscape. Even without AI, it was going to change very rapidly. None of the work that I do now running a marketing agency specializing in like internet marketing and running a podcast and running Twitter accounts. None of that existed when I was a kid. I couldn't have prepared for this. And jobs are changing faster and faster. How are you thinking about that in the context of preparing kids at the University of Austin for careers when AI could change everything? And how, if at all, are you envisioning incorporating AI into what you're building?
Oh, yeah. Oh, these are great questions. So I will give you my personal answer for this. I don't know that I can't speak for the university on this because I don't think we've figured this all out yet. But, one of the things that I think is great, one of the things that attracted me to UATX when thinking about my own kids is the fact that it's a small class size. The students are learning via the Socratic method with the instructor in a classroom, no electronic devices. So it's these kind of long lecture sessions where you're learning in dialogue with your teacher. So from my point of view, just speaking for myself, I don't think it matters if the students are actively using AI. In fact, I think it's positive if they go out and they incorporate AI into their workflows to really enhance their work. I think of it as the stage it's at now is kind of like a turbo spell check, it's an augmentation technology that doesn't replace the need to actually think and engage critically, especially if you're going to have to go have a face-to-face dialogue with your instructor. But on the other hand, it can help you more fully and completely explore and express your ideas. So I think it's positive in that sense. Now, thinking about the trajectory from here, because it's happening so fast, I feel like for all of us, the crystal ball is fuzzy, right? It's hard to see. It's hard to imagine what's out there 5 years out. But that comes back to the core issue. Again, forget, my professional hat, just thinking as a mom, when I was these are the conversations I have with my boys now who are 18 and 14 is, I don't know, when I was in college, I could not have imagined the job title social media manager. That was not a thing. So I don't know what the job titles are going to be in 5 years, but I do know that it's going to be timeless to have a full command of the classics. And not just the classics and the liberal arts, but to learn to think critically and quantitatively. So you should get a solid foundation in math. You should get a solid foundation in the sciences. And to learn how to think critically and break down problems, those are going to be the core skills. And then beyond that, you should pick up some technical skills. And by technical skills, I mean you could learn, become a great musician or become an engineer. But really, if you just pick anything, and I think most people who have learned to do anything, once you become accomplished at one hard thing, you've learned how to learn, and you can apply that skill to other things. And that's how I'm thinking about it for all of our students right now.
If people are interested in the University of Austin, or they're curious to learn more from you, where would you direct them next after listening to this interview?
Oh, that's great. Well, they should check out our website at uaustin.org. And you can always find me on LinkedIn or Twitter or reach out to me via email at kwaters@uaustin.org.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time for this. I know you are incredibly busy building a university out of nothing, and I'm so grateful that you took the time to come out and chat with me.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.